There's this ongoing debate, right, John, about whether politics is downstream from culture or culture's downstream from politics. You know, it's been a thousand-year-old debate. What's your take on that? Who's to blame?
Well, if you put it like that, who's to blame? I would say culture must come first. I mean, I think there is a feedback loop,
Right.
And I think politics can play a helpful or an unhelpful role in culture and in our society. You know, there's that old saying, you get the politicians you deserve. I think it's true in a wider sense than that. We get the politics we deserve.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we seek to elevate the conversation about the things that matter, or should matter, deeply human questions about meaning, purpose, and hope. No matter what you believe, we hope you'll join us exploring the complexities, the struggles, and the joys of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. It's great to have your company.
And I'm Max Jagannathan.
Great to see you, Max. Now, Max, we're often told, as part of modern social protocol, to avoid talking about politics and religion at pubs and dinner parties and family gatherings. And honestly, there are times where that advice is probably right. But Max, you've worked in professional politics. You're now with us here at Centre for Public Christianity. So this is clearly a social rule you struggle to follow all the time.
Yeah, that's right, Simon. I've always disagreed to some degree and struggled with this one. For me, politics and religion, as I see it, are two of the most consequential and important things that we could possibly think and talk about. And so I understand that there are times where we have to be careful and refrain perhaps, but I think the more conversation about them in principle, when it's done in the right way, of course, is a good thing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I just think there are some family situations that better off just talking about the footy.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Hello. Of course, I agree with you, Max. Now, we are in the lead up to an election campaign here in Australia, which is happening amid a heap of geopolitical and economic uncertainty. Everyone's aware of that. So maybe there's never been a better time to take a step back and think through these things. And so now, with all of this in mind, Max, you've tracked down one of Australia's foremost experts in politics and religion, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the Australian National University, John Warhurst.
Yeah, that's right, Simon. John is a brilliant thinker and an internationally acclaimed political scientist, but also a humble and really gracious guy. So it's a real joy to have John join us on Life and Faith. He's just the right person for this topic. I began the interview by asking John how he became interested in politics and how that interest shaped his personal and professional path over the years.
Basically, I grew up in a household that was interested in politics, not necessarily in the party political sense, although they may have been as parents without me knowing it, but they provided a household in which there was discussion of political affairs worldwide. I was brought up in Time and Life magazine and that sort of material. My mother and father were readers, and it was a Catholic household. There was always plenty of Catholic material too. There were local newspapers which always featured world affairs. So I think that was really the basis of it. And by the time I got to university, after leaving school, politics was my first choice at Flinders University in Adelaide, and I did some other things like economics, but my path was set, I suppose. I always felt that while other disciplines might be professionally useful, that politics was the big discipline that explained the world, or at least tried to, and I wanted to be part of that world.
Now, in the interest of full disclosure, John, you were my professor when I was at the ANU studying political science some 20 years ago now.
Right, and you survived the experience, Max.
I did survive it, but more impressively, John, you survived it. So I'm glad that we're still in touch and we both survived that.
Exactly.
Now, I remember having you for a number of subjects, but one of them I remember was Australian federal politics, which was really kind of a ground-up 101 explainer module about our political system. Now, I'm interested in your view on what your take is on the level of understanding out there in the public about how our system works. How do you think we stack up, in your opinion, and how do you think we stack up internationally as well?
Sure. I think we're probably not much better and not much worse than most other Western countries around the world. They're the ones that I'm able to speak about. Look, I think in a word, I don't think there is a high level of understanding of our political system, that politics students like yourself were a self-selected bunch, and your level of understanding was pretty high. But as a report which has come out just today on civics and the year 10 students' understanding of our political system, it's pretty poor. It's less than a third of year 10 students in Australia, and this is after decades of an attempt to talk about civics in schools, who really understand what's going on. And that's at two levels, I think. One is, before we get to sort of a detailed understanding of the federal system or separation of powers, the role of the states and so on, the more general question of what politics is about, what the responsibilities of representatives might be, what democracy even is about. I think the general knowledge in the community is fairly limited about these things. It's something that I feel deeply about, because it leads on to a whole range of other things. Not only do I think that knowledge and participation in our democratic system is a good that we should all be aiming for, but I think also in a practical sense, and Australia has done more than most countries through our electoral system, through our electoral commission, through our schools, to instill an understanding of politics. But still, to many people, I think, the majority, I would say, unfortunately, politics is something out there. The barbecue in the backyard or the family, of course, these things have to rate more highly. But it means that when we get to elections, we get to decisive moments in our political life, or when we get to decisive international events and national events, it's a fairly superficial base on which we're working. And I think those of us who feel we understand, probably, if we're not careful, we live in a bubble where we're surrounded by people who understand politics and democracy and notions such as these. But I think in the wider world, there's not that understanding.
Do you think, to some degree, that superficial levels of understanding, do you think that drives some of the cynicism out there?
Look, I think if you don't know about something, you tend not to trust it perhaps enough. And once that happens, I think we are cynical. I mean, I think there are other broader themes in Australian life, such as the tall poppy syndrome, for instance, and a bit of an egalitarianism, which is a real plus and which is something I applaud. But I think that might lead to a feeling that, oh, well, politics is for other people, and because there are other people that I might not know, or that might take themselves too seriously, or so on, then I'll be cynical. A feeling that perhaps people are in it for themselves. And if that's the case, and if that's the way our society works, then the implications are there, not just for politics, but for relationships and interactions and work life. And so I wouldn't want to isolate politics, although we're talking about politics today. I think it's perhaps broader themes which run through the whole of society.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. On the other side of things, I guess, not wanting to get too mired by the challenges we face, I've also read plenty of commentary and from experts, people just like yourself, that say, we do have our challenges, but Australia also does okay. The fact that we have a compulsory voting system, that helps us a lot, that keeps our kind of political debate centred perhaps, and at least with, we're in an election year now, there's an election coming up. And so at times like that, people do tend to engage more naturally than they might in other countries. Is that overly simplistic, or is that at least some kind of a silver lining on some of the clouds?
No, I think there is a silver lining there, and you're right to point to it. And at election time, I think we should cultivate that silver lining and be happy and comfortable with it. We are, in one very abstract sense, I think, a model democracy. And there are various types, of course, but for a long time now, we've been a relatively stable democracy. We've had changes of government largely peacefully and painlessly. And compulsory voting means that we are naturally inclined to try and talk to the whole community when we're talking at election time, because we know, even for practical reasons, everyone will be voting. And I think the preferential voting system is also a plus, because it means that you're not left with a choice of two parties or two people who neither of whom appeal to you. You've got other options with independents and minor parties, and you can vote for them and then still transfer your vote into a choice between the two major players. We have an electoral commission who, postal voting, voting in remote areas. I think in a whole range of other ways, our system is set up really well, and other countries around the world recognise that and look for our advice and see us as a model in some ways, Max.
I want to get into the meat of the election campaign and it being an election year, and to talk a bit about the actual political landscape in substance, John. We see this, continuing simmering of tensions in our political landscape in Australia and internationally to a large degree, where people are becoming increasingly divided, polarised, vitriolic and, personal in their political attacks and opinions. You've talked a bit about, how much it would help if we all just had a better understanding of politics and maybe just talked about it more. But beyond that, obviously it's multifactorial, but what's your take on what's driving that in Australia and globally, that increased levels of polarisation and vitriol?
You're right, it is multifactorial, and we can only point to some of the factors. I think we can't avoid the fact that we're in a world where there's increased inequality and to some extent continual violence around the world. So there are many people in our community and elsewhere who perhaps rightly feel that they're not being given a fair go. We talk about the fair go in Australia, and maybe one of the weaknesses of the Australian system is that we look to government, and we look to government, I suppose, in a generally positive sense, and we expect governments to deliver economically and in other ways, security and safety. And when that's not happening, I think we're inclined perhaps to be down in the dumps about our political system and our politicians and our, you hear often young person, and I'm far removed from that, saying, people are not listening, politicians are not listening, politicians are not delivering for me.
Right.
And to some extent, I do think there are generational challenges. If you look at the way people vote, for instance, which is one measure, those 18 to 24 have quite a different perspective on things from those over 55. In some ways, it's a real gulf between the two. I think that politics can only be seen in the context of what's going on in society as a whole, and therefore there you'd want to mention the rise of social media, the globalization and the internationalization of the economy and economic and political life. So we should perhaps be glad that I'm not always happy with the state of debate in Australian life, but given the pressures on it, and given the pressure on how individuals are coping with their lives, and I don't just mean economically, but the challenges of mental health, the challenges of other serious issues like that in the community, I think we're coping pretty well. And so I look forward to the election with hope, but I still feel that we should be calling out and trying to establish boundaries as to how politics will be conducted over the next 2 or 3 months. And it's my responsibility, your responsibility, and others to hold the public dialogue to account, not just for the way it's conducted, certainly, and we all should be able to do that. There is always a debate about freedom of speech versus trying to deal with misinformation and these sorts of things, and that people will sit differently on that debate. But there's a lot that we can call out, and it should be a time where our, what do they say? Our better angels come to the fore, rather than politics shouldn't be a time for fear and division and darkness. And we should reward those who are seeking to represent us if they are putting a positive face on the world around us. And we should watch out for exaggeration, of course, and inability to deliver, those sorts of things. But we should all try and create a context in which the election can be conducted on the very best of terms by all players, everyone who wants to have a say, and the majority should be listened to, but so should the minorities in our community.
You're listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Max Jagannathan, and we're listening to Max speak to John Warhurst, the Emeritus Professor of Political Science, and we're talking about how the tone of our politics flows into other aspects of our lives, our mental health, the strength of our communities. And Max goes on here to ask John about how politics relates to culture.
There's this ongoing debate, right, John, about whether politics is downstream from culture or culture's downstream from politics. You know, it's been a thousand-year-old debate, millennia-old debate. What's your take on that as to how politics relates to, you know, the values and the prevailing cultural currents and trends that are out there in society? Who's to blame?
Well, if you put it like that, who's to blame? I would say culture must come first. I mean, I think there is a feedback loop.
Right.
And I think politics can play a helpful or an unhelpful role in culture and in our society. But, you know, there's that old saying, you get the politicians you deserve. I think it's true in a wider sense than that. We get the politics we deserve. And often it's amplified in politics. But let's call it out. I look at relations within families, relations at the neighborhood level, relations in organizations, where often the tone of the debate, if you wanted to call it that, is equally as challenging and as divisive as it can be in the big world of capital P politics. So our politicians and those who conduct their affairs, they're rooted in society. They come from society. They're enabled by what society allows and encourages. So for me, culture comes first. Bearing in mind the feedback loop, because I think I'll say voices of sanity, but I don't mean there's no sanity elsewhere, but those who have a voice and are established in the community as someone we should listen to shouldn't be feeding back negatively into the political space. I think they should always be emphasizing the positives.
Yeah, right. No, I totally hear what you're saying. And you kind of touched on that earlier too, which I wanted to pick up on, this idea that we do need to be, particularly in an election year, aware of and be careful of, you know, those currents of darkness and cynicism and division. That seems to create another tension then, especially in, you know, free democratic societies like ours, John, where we don't really want divisiveness, but we do need division, don't we, for democracy to work well? We don't want everyone in Parliament House agreeing. Then it effectively becomes kind of a one-party groupthink system.
Look, you're absolutely right. We do want choice, and life would be very boring and politics would get nowhere if we didn't have choice. We don't want an echo chamber. We don't want everyone saying the same things. And we would quickly, if they did, we would quickly say, well, that's inauthentic. That's... you know, I can't take you at face value because you're not being honest with me. And I think one of the good things about modern day politics is that we do value honesty, at least honesty on some sides. I think we also have to be, this is a bit of a side move, but I think we have to look at ourselves very, very closely. I think, you know, sometimes we condemn people we disagree with for engaging in division and toxicity, but when it happens on someone we generally agree with, we let that slide through, and we're not as critical. And I think we're all guilty of that.
Sure.
Was it John F. Kennedy who said, and I'm paraphrasing, ask what you can do for your country, not what the country can do for you. And too often we say, well, politicians are letting us down. They're a bunch of crooks, and the corporates are letting us down. They can't be trusted. And, you know, we're surrounded by people who can't be trusted or who are self-interest, but moi, I'm a clean slate. I'm not about self-interest, and I'm always generous in my appreciation of others. There's a lot of talk about the value of table talk these days and kitchen table conversations, and we often avoid, and I say this of myself too, we often avoid people whose opinions we disagree with. Consciously or subconsciously, we look for newspapers and media that, you know, launch our boat that we like. Right. We don't want to listen to others, and that's not a good thing. And at an election time, all of us could do very well to have honest conversations within our extended family, and boy, isn't that difficult sometimes. Or we could have honest conversations with our community, our neighbours, but we tend to shy away from them. We go into our shell, I think. So it becomes a sort of a shouting match between that level of political players and the general community, rather than the general community, fully taking responsibility for the state of political life in our country. And that might sound naive, and I've been accused of being naive, but I just think you should always aim for the best in society. Sure, sometimes other people are to blame for some things, but blaming others or blaming higher ups or blaming, is not going to get us anywhere.
I'm fascinated by this, John, because I agree with all of this. And I think the way you're speaking repeatedly now, you've mentioned things like self-reflection and, humility and personal responsibility. And these are largely, certainly concepts, and even more certainly heart and mind postures that are largely absent, from so much of our public conversation around politics. With that in mind, to turn then to, one of your subspecialty areas of expertise within political science, I know you've taught and written extensively on religion and politics, on faith and values in politics. To look back, there's this, beautiful quote that I'm sure you're aware of from Manning Clark, one of our great historians, who referred to Australia's relationship with religion as a shy hope in the heart. How would you describe current political consciousness as it relates to faith and spirituality?
That's a big, big question. Sociologists of religion once said that Australia had a lukewarm approach to faith and to religion. And I grew up my whole life really where, even on the university campus, it was very rare to engage in discussions about faith and spirituality. For me anyway, unless you really sort it out. And I went through my university life, this is not a deflection of the question, really not knowing about the faith and spirituality of many of my colleagues over a long period of time. And it often shocked me years later that someone did have a faith life, or at least was involved in a church community, and their values were shaped by that faith community. So Australia's political consciousness is very difficult to read just through the lens of faith and spirituality. When I talk about faith communities, I find that you can't really separate ethnicity, religion, and class in many ways. My upbringing as a Catholic, which was a very comfortable middle class upbringing, faith was very central to it, or at least religious observance was very central. And it was an Irish Catholic background too, although I've got many different streams in my heritage. Somehow that adopted the Irish view of the world, which was that they were a minority and they tended to be put down by the rest of society, almost a chip on your shoulder view of the rest of the world, a tribal view. And I think tribalism is evident in Australian society. When I was growing up, it was a tribalism mostly involved the Christian denominations, who often were hardly mixed. I found that hard to explain to young students who thought sectarianism and battles among Christians was that was a thing of the past. And now we've got much deeper divisions involving multiculturalism, interfaith relations, the rise of secularism. There's so many more, in a sense, competing values in society today. So I would, this is a roundabout way of coming at your question, Max, but I would distinguish between the role of organized religion in politics and in society, and we could talk about that, from the role of deeper values and faith and more private spirituality, which would shape a person's view of politics and of what is good, bad, and indifferent in society. Such people may not think their faith is leading them in a particular direction, but its emphasis on, let's say, individualism versus collectivism will play out in the political realm. And you can see how one of my interests was how political leaders express their faith. We've seen in recent times very different expressions of faith among our political leaders. I don't just mean prime ministers and premiers, but leaders at all levels. Some of it is much more expressive. Some of it relates to particular values, whether they be social justice or freedom of expression, which become the prime movers of how they read the whole of what's going on in politics and what their priorities are. And here's a big call. I think there might be a general agreement or a consensus among Australians about the top 10 values that should drive our politics.
Mm.
But I don't think there's agreement about the priorities among those top 10.
Right. They're
And
ordered. They're ordered very
the
differently.
order, the order of merit, if you like. And so people who really have more in common than they think, because their one or two prime values seem to differ, may think they have not much in common. But if they would talk to one another and get to know one another better, they would realize that there's a lot they have in common. And perhaps one of the downsides of politics and the need to communicate in short grabs, slogans, let's say, is that undercuts a more nuanced discussion about what we value and how we should live our lives, how we're searching for the common good in our lives, which to me has to be the ultimate value, to live the good life and to be concerned about our community and to have a say. That's how my faith has shaped me, not necessarily in party political terms, I don't think, but in the feeling that you can't hide your light under a bushel, if you like. You should be in your community, whatever that community may be, and as far as you can, leading a life which reflects those values.
That's a very powerful and refreshingly important thing for people to hear at the moment, running in an election campaign, but beyond that, just always for the future of our society building project, that people of faith can and should have their faith help shape and influence their political involvement, but that by no means necessarily has to be a party political thing. And we do find, as you've alluded to, people of faith on both sides of politics. So just to take things offshore for a moment, you talked about how political leaders often will use their faith or express their faith in particular ways to signal values. And some of the time I'm sure it's authentic, and some of the time I'm sure it's inauthentic, and a lot of the time I'm sure it's political. But what's your take on how faith-based politics has actually influenced a lot of the broader culture wars that are happening? And it seems like Australia's certainly part of the game, even though things might not be as extreme here. I mean, we look at Donald Trump's political strategy during his campaign last year, particularly as it related to, evangelical voters, especially white evangelicals. You see things happening in continental Europe around faith-based language and values being used there. Just interested in your thoughts on faith-based politics in that sense, in being mapped onto the culture wars, for better or worse.
I think it's for worse rather than better. That would be my gut reaction, just to set the
clear on that.
Clear on that right from the start, Max. That I think too often, you mentioned Donald Trump's, and he's not the only one by any means, attempting to capture segments of the community by signalling that he's one of them, if you like, or that he holds values which accord with theirs. And I think Americans use what I'd call biblical or religious language in a way which often jars with Australians. We're not always saying God be with you or God willing. I'm also a sports fanatic, and I see sports people saying not saying I won the race because God was with me, but going pretty close to that sometimes.
Right.
Even God bless America, which is not a phrase which is easily transferable to Australia, I don't think, although it may be more transferable now than it was 50 years ago when I was growing up. I think we were much less comfortable with outward expressions of faith language than we are now, and that's largely a good thing, I think, up to a point. But it almost gets to the stage of trying to convince voters that because of my religious life or because of my calling to politics, God has called me to stand for politics. I think that's a slippery slope. I'm personally not happy with that. God is calling all of us to play a role in making our community and our society a better place. But when we personalize it, that I have an individual call, at least my faith doesn't sit comfortably with that. Now, maybe there would be other faiths and other expressions of the Christian faith which is framed in that way and which would not be jarring to that community at all. But to me, it is. I think I would rather be... I appreciate knowing about the faith life of individual leaders and other people, but I don't want it rammed down my throat too much. And I'm unhappy with those who would say that something which is faith-driven is by its nature, and this could be a person or a government program, is better than something which is not faith-driven. I think religious values are so much inculcated even in a secular society that I'm unhappy, and this happens in my own religious community, go dangerously close to saying church schools are better than public schools. Or, if we want an employment service, then better to have a good religious person in charge, or better to have it infused by religious values than have someone who's a humanist and gives no indication of having religious values. I just think that's in a pluralist society where we should be accepting all, we should be appreciating that everyone in society has a set of values which we should respect. Some of them will be overtly faith-driven. Some of them will be, the fair go or the social justice value is, not only is it widespread among all faiths, but it's also widespread among nuns. That is None, not Nuns.
Right.
And
well, both nuns and nuns.
Nuns and nuns, both are working side by side often in the very best of causes, which I appreciate. And I think one of the downsides of the culture wars is that we do tend to put down other views of the world, other world views. And it's very easy to do that and to be in our own faith bubble or whatever it is. And I think others sometimes feel, well, you Christians or you religious people are a bit bombastic. You're a bit sneering of others. And I think there's still a residual feeling in the community that people of faith should hold themselves to higher standards. I really do feel that. And when you don't, you're a hypocrite. And that is a charge which can be leveled against people of faith sometimes, not always unfairly. What we claim and how we live our lives should be in sync. And of course, we're all don't live up to our own values. Of course not. But I think the worst sin, in inverted commas, and I use that in a very broad sense, is when someone is clearly advocating in public contrary to the way they're living their life. And if their business life or their family life or their community life, whatever, is a bit dodgy, then be humble about it, but don't be caught trying to preach to others. That word preach, I think, has a secular connotation as well as a religious connotation, and sometimes we, from the faith communities, can be a bit preachy, and I think that doesn't go down well at all with the general community. And the higher you are, the longer you fall. And we've seen that with some religious leaders.
So the key for you, John, for a healthier politics and a more positive and vibrant election year where our democracy is at its best, is one that begins with actually self-reflection and the little things and personal integrity and faithfulness for each of us as Australians, no matter what we believe.
Yes, you've summed up how I think very well. That's where we should all start, and then go on to perhaps judge others or choose between competing programs or choose between competing leaders, but begin with a lot of self-reflection about our own responsibility for, let's say, the state of Australia or the state of the world or the state of our local community, and then go on to look at what's on offer, because it is a competition ultimately, what's on offer in the political space as we come to a federal election.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Max Jagannathan.
Thank you to Professor John Warhurst for his time. As the election campaign approaches, there's going to be no shortage of attacks, tension, division and discord out there. John's insights on the importance of self-reflection, humility, active participation and just staying positive generally are all a welcome and timely reminder and encouragement for all of us.
Absolutely is. And if you've enjoyed this episode, or you've heard something that sparked your interest or was put in a way that you'd never heard before, or whatever else you liked about it, we know that you know others who might get something out of it too. So why don't you share it with them? Do it now so you don't forget. and leave us a rating or review. It helps get Life and Faith out to more people. Next time.
One of the problems with the history of the White Rose is when you have a resistance activity, it's not necessarily terribly well documented, because to document it is incredibly dangerous. So the pamphlets are the manifesto. There is not a clear statement of motivation necessarily that says, okay, this is how we must act.